Good afternoon. Yeah. So welcome to the second session of the conference. My name is Susan Hwang, and I teach Korean literature and culture studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here at Indiana University. This session will feature presentations from three highly renowned scholars in Korean studies. From the perspective of their respective disciplinary expertise, they will each speak with regards to the historical trajectory and the socio-political implications of Korean democracy today, as well as the cultural conduits that both facilitated and animated the social energy for democratization in South Korea. So at the end of each presentation, we will spend about 5 to 7 minutes for a brief Q&A for each speaker. And after all three presentations are finished, we will hold a longer, more extensive Q&A session during which the audience members will have a chance to ask questions to any of the three speakers. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you the first of our three speakers for the session. Our first presenter is Dr. Paul Chang. Dr. Chang is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. He is the author of the recently published book entitled Protest Dialectics, State Repression and South Korea's Democracy Movement from 1970 through 1979, as well as the co-editor of South Korean Social Movements from Democracy to Civil Society. Dr. Chang's research on social and political change in South Korea has been featured in numerous scholarly journals, including Social Forces, Mobilization, and the Journal of Korean Studies. His talk today is entitled The Legacy of Social Movements for South Korea's Democratization. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chang.
Okay, so I'd like to first thank Director Seung-Yeon Kim and the Institute for Korean Studies for inviting me to participate in this important and timely conference, and to Susan for the generous introduction. I also want to express my I also want to express the fact that it's a true honor to be on the same program with some of my academic heroes, including Professors Bruce Cummings, Park Tae-gin, and Young Ju-yu. And it's really a privilege for me to be here, so thank you for having me. So I thought we'd start with a bit of history. I know Professor Cummings touched upon some of this, so some of this might be redundant, but I want to try to help us to contextualize the particular social movement history that I want to reflect on today. So the promise of a democratic Korea was made on August 15th, 1948, with the official founding of the Republic of Korea. Established with the support of the United Nations, South Korea represented one of the first demarcations of the political line that would come to define the emerging world order in the aftermath of World War II. South Korea was to be a beacon of democracy and capitalism, juxtaposed to what was then the real viable alternative of world communism. The following month, the DPRK, North Korea, was founded, and these two states occupying a small peninsula in East Asia became symbols for a larger Cold War that engulfed the world in the post-war era. It is a curious thing, then, that South Korea did not transition to democracy until 40 years after. June 29, 1987 was a watershed moment in South Korea's political maturation. Against the backdrop of a hot summer's day that burned even brighter due to the street protests that had occurred in the weeks before, Roh Tae-woo, chosen successor to President Chun Doo-hwan, announced the reinstitution of direct presidential elections. The June Declaration was a significant turning point, and South Korea is now a celebrated case of democratization in the, quote, third wave of democracy. The content, and indeed the necessity, of the 1987 June Declaration would have surprised observers of Korea in 1948. The victory of the Allied powers in World War II and the subsequent presence of the United States in East Asia brought to the region new political and economic forms. Countries occupied by the United States including most importantly Japan, were to be democratic capitalist polities acting as bulwarks against the spread of communism. After Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial rule, it was readily assumed that Korea would be a single nation governed by democratically elected leaders. But in 1948, Kim Il-sung and the Northern leadership refused to allow the United Temporary Commission on Korea, which was to oversee the formation of an independent Korean government, to enter its sphere of influence. The failure of the United Nations to hold a peninsula-wide presidential election all but secured the formal division of the Korean country. The UN-sponsored election in 1948 was held only in southern Korea and brought to power Syngman Rhee, who was to dominate South Korean politics until 1960. Although the Republic of Korea, quote, officially espoused liberal democracy as its form of government from the outset, in the context of the Cold War, national security and economic development took precedence over freedom and liberty. Democracy gave way to dictatorship, and South Korea was ruled by authoritarian leaders until the reinstatement of direct presidential elections in 1987. The democracy promised in 1948 would evade South Koreans for 4 decades, sacrificed for the sake of security and development. In the end, democracy was not to be something granted, but had to be won by a burgeoning, contentious civil society that emerged and evolved within the context of authoritarian rule. Despite autocratic rule, the movement for democracy developed throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s. Today, civil society is an influential political force in Korea, so influential that some have dubbed it the, quote, fifth branch of government, in addition to the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and following the media industry, the honorary, quote, fourth branch. When asked about the historical origins of South Korean civil society, activists today are likely to fall back on a teleological narrative of people's movements that starts with the Donghak Uprising of 1894, moves through the March 1st, 1919 movement, independence movement, and includes in the post-liberation period the April Revolution of 1960, the anti-Yushin movement in the 1970s, the Gwangju Uprising in 1980, and the June protests in the summer of 1987. And although moral impetus and legitimacy are garnered from the historical continuity that this broad narrative engenders, it is important to appreciate both the qualitatively distinct context from which these movements arose and the specific mechanisms by which they are directly and indirectly connected. Justifiably, much has been written about the Gwangju Uprising and the Minjung movement in the 1980s. Today, however, I would like to focus attention on social movements in the 1960s and 1970s to not only provide historical context, but also to remind us that even in the darkest moments of Korean democracy, social movements found a way to adapt to state repression and establish the organizational and ideological foundations that bore fruit in the 1980s and beyond. To be sure, the student revolution in April 1960 was the seminal moment of South Korea's democratization. At the time, the April Revolution was the largest instance of student and public mobilization in South Korean history, which in turn became a model and inspiration for all social movements after it. In particular, the April Revolution contributed to student democratization movements in the 1970s and 1980s, and indeed even today in several tangible ways. First, students who participated in the protests that brought down Syngman Rhee constituted a distinct cohort that was shaped by a successful attempt at altering the political trajectory of South Korea. The immediate success of the April Revolution contributed to a contentious collective identity and a shared purpose amongst students who believed that they possessed a moral mandate to protect the social and political development of the nation. And although by the 1970s, the students who participated in the 1960 protests had long since graduated and were in their late 20s and 30s by the time Park Chung-hee instituted the authoritarian Yushin system in 1972, a core group of them continued to support the democracy movement by playing advisory roles to students in the 1970s. A second important legacy of the student revolution in 1960 was the development of organizational strategies that became important models for later student movements. With the support of the opposition Democratic Party, students from several universities founded the National Student Committee for Fair Elections on February 28, 1960. The goal of this organization of more than 200 members was to ensure fairness in the 1960 presidential and vice presidential elections. After the elections, the National Student Committee for Fair Elections publicized the irregularities that its members observed at several voting booths across the nation and helped to mobilize the protests that culminated in the April Revolution. Perhaps more important than monitoring elections, however, was the significance of national solidarity across universities and colleges throughout the country. Although students have mobilized in the past, the students participating in the April Revolution started the trend of national coalition building with the explicit goal of maximizing student power through solidarity. This strategy would pervade mobilizing efforts of students later in the 1970s and 1980s as well. For example, it is not a coincidence that when Park Chung-hee forced through a constitutional amendment in 1969, allowing him to run for a third presidential term in 1971, the current students would borrow from the mobilizing model created by students in 1960. Students across Korea's major universities, including Korea University, that's them, Yonsei, Seoul National, Seogang, Seongkyungwan, Gyeongbuk National, and Jeonnam National, created on April 15, 1971, the National Alliance of Youth and Students for the Protection of Democracy. One of their major activities following the strategy of students in 1960 was to monitor the 1971 elections and report any corruption involved. In addition, however, true to form, the National Alliance represented a nationwide coordination which in turn contributed much to the material and symbolic power of students against the Yushin regime. A third important legacy of the April Revolution was the simple fact that it was successful in achieving at least its immediate goal of ousting Syngman Rhee. This positive outcome contributed to the belief that civil disobedience grounded in the moral mandate to speak truth to power was not only efficacious but necessary. As Doug McAdam argues in regard to the American Civil Rights Movement, past movement success is a critical incentive for further mobilization because it contributes to the, quote, cognitive liberation of activists who come to believe that change is indeed possible. The April Revolution was that kind of seminal moment in Korean student movement history specifically, and for Korean civil society generally. The success of the April Revolution loomed large over dissidents who fought Park Chung-hee's government in the 1970s and Chun Doo-hwan's regime in the 1980s. As the underclassmen, the Hube, of the April 19 student protest generation, students in the 1970s and 1980s believed that they too could change the political destiny of their country. In hindsight, it is quite remarkable that when Park Chung-hee executed his coup d'etat in 1961, he professed that his May 16 military coup was an extension and fulfillment of the April 19 student movement. And that rhetoric quickly dissipated as Park almost immediately turned to highly repressive measures to put down protests against his Japan policy. The Garrison Decree of June 3, 1964 led to violent clashes with students who failed to stop the Korean government from reestablishing diplomatic relationships with Japan in 1965. Students were also unable to stop Park Chung-hee from amending the Constitution to allow for a third term in 1971, which ultimately was only a preamble for the institutionalization of authoritarianism in 1972 with the passing of the Yushin Constitution. It was during the Yushin period that state repression reached new heights. Perhaps the pinnacle of that repression was the prosecution of members of the so-called People's Revolutionary Party that was identified as a communist organization behind the massive student protests against Park's government. In addition to executing 8 members of the PRP, the so-called PRP, the Yushin regime began the campaign to systematically put down and end the student movement by rounding up more than 1,000 student leaders after Emergency Decree 4 was promulgated in April of 1974. Emergency Decree 4 and later Decrees 7 and 9 in 1975 fundamentally limited public protests as shown in this figure, which visualizes the annual counts of protest events from 1972 to 1979. So you can clearly see that the movement is declining, at least in absolute numbers. If we limit, because all the students are in jail, if we limited our analysis to only macro indicators of social movements, such as the total number of protest events, we would miss an important development in social movements during the Yushin period. Even as the total number of protests dwindled after the PRP case and the emergency decrees, the democracy movement continued to develop in important ways, in large part because of the violent repression of students. Different sectors of Korean society became increasingly politicized. This diversification of actors participating in the democracy movement was spearheaded by Christians, whose concerns for the poor and downtrodden evolved into a call for the liberation of the Minjung, or the people, under Park's dictatorial rule. As shown in this figure, we can see that Christians organized as a percentage of total protests, more protests than any other group, including students, in the highly repressive emergency decree era. As Park Chung-hee's Yushin government found new ways to repress society, including instituting all-encompassing censorship laws and compromising access to fair legal trials for dissidents, Christians were joined by other sectors of society. Journalists, led by a new generation of personnel at 동아일보, one of the leading newspapers in Korea, became important participants in the democracy movement as their initial protests against censorship evolved into a criticism of the political system itself. After their seminal Declaration of Action for a Free Press in 1974, the government forced 동아일보 executives to fire more than 100 reporters, photographers, and broadcast announcers in the spring of 1975. Predictably, after they were thrown out onto the streets, they joined street protests. Perhaps an easy way to measure how repressive Park's government is to note that dissidents were not the only ones who were arrested and incarcerated for their dissent. The fact that lawyers were also thrown into jail simply for defending dissidents is a testament to the extensive reach of state repression. This is a picture of Kang Shin-ok, who was one of the lawyers defending the members of the so-called People's Revolutionary Party. After death sentences were meted out for the 8 defendants, in his final defense statement, he accused the government of committing legalized murder and vowed that history would judge the Park regime. For his statements, he was thrown in jail. Upon his release, he went on to become a prominent member of the first generation of human rights lawyers in Korea. And finally, one key development in social movements in the 1970s was the increasing politicization of workers. While workers' strikes were not unknown prior to the Yushin period, it was during the height of Park Chung-hee's rule, after the self-immolation protests of Chun Tae-il on November 13, 1970, that workers began to understand labor repression in the context of dictatorship. Incidents such as the Dongil textile women's workers' struggle in 1976 and the YH Company's women's protest in the opposition party building in 1979 were early signs of labor politicization that later culminated in the Great Workers' Struggle in 1987. Overall, then, the 1970s represent a unique moment in Korean social movement history as radical students, the primary movement actor in the 1960s, were joined by diverse sectors of society against Park Chung-hee's authoritarian government. It was in the 1970s that the important pillars of civil society today, the free press movement, human rights lawyering, and a highly organized labor movement first emerged. When contemplating the larger meaning of social movements, it is perhaps necessary to tie together the significance of protests in the 1960s through the 1980s with the state of South Korean democracy generally. Following the recent impeachment of President Park Geun-hye, international media and foreign scholars alike have praised South Korea for being, quote, Asia's most advanced democracy. This is a familiar narrative that not only situates South Korea as part of the third wave of democratization, but one of the exemplary cases in an impressive cohort of young democracies. Whether the recent impeachment truly represents the triumph of democracy, as widely reported, it is abundantly clear that this past fall and winter, we were witnesses to an unprecedented moment in global protest culture. Never has the world seen such large-scale demonstrations. Upon consulting with social movement scholars who are experts in movements as diverse as the civil rights movement in America to the recent Arab Spring movement in the Middle East, they expressed their bewilderment at how large the recent candlelight protests have been in Korea. To put things into comparative perspective, the largest democratic revolutions at the turn of the new century in post-communist states included protests of around 600,000 in Serbia and Montenegro on September 24, 2000, 100,000 in Georgia on November 3, 2003, and 1 million on October 31, 2004 in the Ukraine. A more recent example is the January 25th revolution in Egypt that was part of the Arab Spring movement that swept through the Middle East and North Africa. The final day of that Egyptian protest cycle recorded 1.2 million participants on February 11, 2011, across roughly 60 events nationwide. In short, The candlelight protests this past fall and winter in South Korea are unprecedented, not only in Korea, but in the global history of people's movements. Furthermore, millions of people mobilized for several months in what amounted to peaceful demonstrations against the corruption of Park Geun-hye's government. It is perhaps the combination of the size of the protests and the peaceful nature of the gatherings that is most impressive. When asked by colleagues, journalists, and American friends how Koreans were able to stage such large and peaceful demonstrations, I find myself looking back into history for answers. And as I do, I am left with the vague but rather certain confidence in the thesis that the recent wave of candlelight protests was only possible because of the long and rich history of social movements that began in 1960 with the April Revolution. Without necessarily falling into a Hegelian optimism about the march of history, we can still appreciate how individual moments that, although arise from unique social and political circumstances, sometimes come together in aggregate form, manifest in the culmination of movement tactics, organizational strategies, and ultimately the combined hopes of multiple generations. To be honest, I'm unsure of whether the recent impeachment and now the arrest and indictment of Park Geun-hye taught the world how a truly democracy functions. But at the very least, South Korea did show the world what is possible when the different actors in a democratic polity work for the sake of democracy instead of for the sake of power. The people protested, the legislator voted, and the court judged. Subsequently, South Korea has been thrust in the spotlight as an exemplary democracy. If, as I have tried to argue today, Korean democracy was and is possible in large part because of the history of contentious civil society that fought for decades to achieve the promise of democracy that was made in 1948, it is only a short leap to identify the 1960 April Revolution as the seminal moment, the 1970s anti-Yushin movement as the period when the initial structures of civil society were laid, and the massive protests in 1987 as a culmination of these previous movements. Consequently, as the status of South Korean democracy continues to grow in the world, the meaning of Korea's civil society also changes, reaching new prominence. As scholars often confess, the interpretation of history is always in flux. For these reasons, the significance and legacy of social movements continue to be relevant not only for the history of South Korea, but indeed for the history of participatory democracy in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. We will now take a few questions from the audience for Dr. Chang.
Korean Democratization. My name is Alex Gang. I'm a doctoral student in the School of Public Health. And I have a question about the Korean universities. I mean, undoubtedly, they served as the underpinning niche for democratic movement in the 60s and 70s and so on. So what kind of function does current universities serve in Korean society in terms of promoting the values of democratization? I mean, does the university function as the similar niche for students to get involved in social matters, and also whether the university as the venue, whether this has altered, in terms of, engaging in students into the, centerpiece of society.
The stereotypical answer is that students are now politically apathetic in Korean society. And there are indicators of that. We see an increase in majors in business administration as opposed to sociology, for example, or maybe history or political science. There's at least since post-1997, there's a new sort of current of individualism that's swept through not only the student population, but the society as a whole because of the new neoliberal economy. That is the overall picture. Students will protest. My 4 years of teaching at Yonsei, I saw many protests. They tended to, however, significantly revolve around issues that are relevant for students, like tuition hikes, for example. And they did not as much raise issues that are for the collective good, if whatever that might mean. So there's that stereotype out there. I'm gonna toot one of my students. There was a senior thesis writer, and she studied sort of the political sensibility of students today, and she went there, did a bunch of interviews. And so clearly there's a lot of anxiety and grievances among students that are generalizable to larger society, especially with the high unemployment rate amongst the youth population and things like that. There is a critique. It seemed like it was less political, the critique, and more economic, or maybe more policy-oriented. There are, I guess, still tactics that are used. The Tejabo is one of the classic tactics. The I'm not fine movement. I forgot what the Korean was. 나는 괜찮지 않다, 안 괜찮아, or 괜찮아, or what? 안녕하십니까? Yeah, right. So there was a movement, but that movement, not unlike the Occupy Wall Street movement in America, was the framing of it tended to be quite broad and vague, and not very specific. So I guess what her point, the point of her thesis was ultimately that students think about politics and they think about the economy a lot. It's just channeled in different ways in the new neoliberal economy, more towards individual grievances and anxieties about the job market and what the government is trying to do to help the young population. That's my general sense. Again, this is not my, I study more 1970s, but that's my general sense.
Thank you very much for that truly fascinating talk. I wonder if you could comment about how this remarkable display of maturity and public engagement politically in Korea is cutting across another recent trend of Korean democracy, which is the extreme polarization in Korean politics. I mean, one of the characteristics of the democratic era has been the prosecution of former presidents and of some of their family members and that sort of thing, even leading to really the suicide of Roh Moo-hyun a few years ago. This has also been a characteristic, and perhaps a less attractive one, of modern Korean democracy. But I'm wondering if this display, this candlelight movement, which was remarkably peaceful, as you said, has somehow contributed to transcending the deep divisions, for lack of better terms, between conservatives and progressives in Korean democracy, in Korean society. Divisions seem to be related not only to the political management of the Republic of Korea itself, but also attitudes towards North Korea, for instance. Are we getting beyond some of that history at this point in Korean democracy?
So first I would say that the polarization of Korean society, politics and society as a whole, is not recent. Clearly, as Bruce Cummings clearly mapped out, it's been going on for a long time. We can actually probably go even further back to the Shanghai Provisional Government in the 1920s and the factional strifes that were happening then, and that sort of culminating in what we have today. One of the things, I actually went to the December 6th protest, which was the Saturday protest right before the National Assembly voted to impeach her. And that was sort of the pinnacle of the protest. And this is all obviously personal, anecdotal, but the feeling I got was how incredibly unified the country was. I kind of walked away from that like this was before she was actually impeached. And at the time, I kept thinking, what's left? What is there left to say? The whole country is against you, you know? And the second thought I had, though, was it's knowing how polarized Korean society is, how egregious must her sins have been for her to be able to create solidarity like this nationwide. True, there were pro-Park factions, a few, sort of marginal, seems like fringe groups to me, but who knows? But this is like the whole country coming out, and this was just in Seoul, so this is happening all over the country. So I don't know, maybe I'm pessimistic. Personally, other people would know a lot more about this than I would. My gut feeling is it doesn't necessarily represent a coming together of society, like real healing and reconciliation between the two groups, on the left and the right. I think it more represents how egregious the sins were, how bad, and how sensationalized with the whole shaman advisor thing, and that, and the horse riding daughter, and like that, like, so to me, those sensational things really sparked the imagination of the entire country, what felt like to me the entire country, and it was more of a testament to Park Geun-hye and her sins as opposed to a real foundational, long-term, structural coming together between the left and right. I hope I'm wrong. We'll just have to see, but that's my gut sense.
Dr. Chang, yeah, it's me again, Alice Gang. Yeah, sorry for bothering you. Well, my question dates back to 1980s. Under the John Juan regime, sport was one of the three main agendas. So, as far as I know, sport has been widely utilized by the central government to manipulate and to divert public attention from sensitive issues. Yeah. So, how do you evaluate the function of sport, in terms of democratic movement back in 80s and 90s?
So, if I remember correctly, it's the three S's in the 1980s: sport, sex, and screen, right? Movies. And so it was a classic Roman strategy: gladiators, right? Give them entertainment, give them bread, and give them entertainment, and they won't protest against you. So the national, I have this data. It's on one of my slides from my classes. The Korean Baseball Association was established in, I believe, 1985 or so, right around there, and Chunwon literally forced the chaebols, the companies, to sponsor these companies and make a league out of nothing. And the idea was that, so this is where the question's coming from. I would say this, as a sociologist, political scientist, or historian would probably feel the same way. Once there are structures in place, even though the content of those structures that fill the structures can be whatever, can distract the population. Because all the stuff the movies that were okayed at the time, for example, let's talk about movies because that's a little bit easier to think about than baseball, because baseball is less politicized. But once the movie industry, the infrastructure is established, at the time, yeah, maybe the movies that were okayed by the government were not political in any sense, but the same structures, the industry is now in existence, starting from the 80s. And in the 1990s, you started getting movies like Joint Security Area and more. So if you think long-term about it, I guess on the one hand, it's quite effective. It's one of the, I think in the political science literature, they call it the dictator's dilemma, or one manifestation of the dictator's dilemma. On the one hand, you want to establish institutions and infrastructures to keep the people happy, but some of those institutions and infrastructures later on come and bite you because they can be used against you later on. So I don't know about sport and sex, but screens for sure have been used. And there's a whole activist filmmaker movement, actually. There's an entire movement using film as the medium for a protest, right? So I think that's one way of thinking about the long-term ramifications of it.
This might be the last question for the brief Q&A.
Thank you. I'm a PhD student in gender studies, so I noticed that gender and family is one of your expertise. I'm very curious about if there's any interesting findings, like regarding to women in that revolution, and if there are any other interesting findings, comparing to student revolution in China or other countries in Asia. You'd like to share with us? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not an expert. I'm just trying to start this new project, so I'm trying to learn, actually. But I'll say this. I think I mentioned this at lunch to John, that if you're interested in Korea, contemporary Korea, not historical, but contemporary Korea today, other than North Korean nuclear missiles, which is a perennial issue that obviously is important, to me, the demographic revolution, what's happening with the family, is the story. It's going to fundamentally reshape Korean society. A couple of examples. Right now, the international marriage rate is about 10%, hovering around 9 to 11%. And the proportion of biracial children in Korean society in the next 15, 20 years is going to jump to like 20% in elementary school starting in the next 10 years. Koreans are going to physically look different, right? And there are long-term implications for what happens to the male biracial children that have to go to the army? What happens to the whole discourse of unification when the discourse of unification thus far has been based on the same bloodline? What do you do with that, right? So there's that. So if I was to divorce rates, single parenthood, single people not marrying at all. 27% of households are single-person households. That's incredible. That's incredible. That's an incredible thing to think about, that people are forgoing marriage, and there's also all sorts of reasons why. If I was to try to tie it back to what sort of the themes of the day, the argument that I'm trying to develop in this new project is that to try to think historically about this. So the policies that the authoritarian governments established in the 1960s, 1970s, especially two that I'm looking at, urbanization, as the children move to the cities to work in factories and how that leads to smaller family sizes. There's a professor in France who has this great study about apartments that were being raised in Seoul in the 1970s, and she shows that the apartments are built for nuclear families, not for extended families, the actual blueprint of the architecture itself. There's that, and then the expansion of higher education. You go from about 22% of women being educated in 1980, and by the end of that decade, it jumps to like 70%. Now it's like, in the 1960s, Korea maybe had, Bruce Cummings mentioned, that they had the highest number of students per capita in Seoul. That was in 1960. That actually exponentially grew. It's crazy how, so once women start getting educated, they don't want to be housewives. They work. None of my young students, I used to always ask them, the female students, what do you guys want to do after? Nobody wants to get married and stay home. They all want to work. If they want to work, the age of marriage goes up. You get older. Right now it's above 30 now. The average age, the first marriage for women, they're about 32, 33 for men. That leads to less babies. You have less children, right? And as women work and gain capital, divorce rates go up. Think about that. As women start making money, divorce rates go up. This is a common finding in all modern developing. That says a lot about, it wasn't necessarily love in the 60s, right? Just women had no recourse. So I can go on and on about this because it's something I'm super, super really into right now. But for the purposes of the conversation today, to try to think historically about the structures, this is sort of the dictator's dilemma again, the structures that the government, that the developmental state established in the 1960s and how those structures are having these much long-term implications for the social transformation of society, especially in the realm of family. So, yeah.